much for joining us this evening. We are coming live for our first inaugural Potty Talk from MASSTC. We are the Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Test Center. And we are one of the premier test centers for innovative and alternative technologies in North America. But we do a lot more than that. We are here today to talk to you a little bit about all of your wastewater questions, because communicating with the public is something that is really important. And so what we've done is we've pulled questions that we've heard from the public over the last couple months on wastewater. We've also asked you about your own questions on wastewater, and we'll be answering some of the questions you've sent us. And before we kick it off, we're just going to go through some logistics.
Right. All right, so like Alexi said, just a couple of logistical notes here before we get started. We are using Microsoft Teams. Everyone who's in the call was successful in getting on Microsoft Teams, so that's great. A lot of people are used to Zoom, so thanks for working with us and trying out Teams. We're going to talk a little bit between, just the three of us and try to answer some of those general wastewater questions. You might notice that your camera is automatically off and you're automatically on mute. That was by design. We're going to give everybody a chance to voice their Q&A or do a Q&A at the end. If you have any extra questions, we're going to try to leave about half our time for question and answer. So we'll go over how to get your questions answered at the end when we open it up for Q&A. But for now, if you have anything you want to throw in the chat, that's fine. If you are having any trouble with your call quality or any of the device settings, I did just give a little bit of information on how to find that in those two pictures there. If you go to the more and then settings, you can go to device settings. And if you're having any problems with the speaker, that's probably where you're going to be able to fix that. So I think that's all I have for logistics. So I'm going to toss it back over to Alexi.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Sarah is our microbiologist here at MASSTC. Brian, who's here to my right, is the director. And I am the RME coordinator, coordinating a utility for on-site septic systems. So I'm going to kick it over to Brian to explain a little bit about what we do.
Sure. Of course, Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Test Center, Technology Center, MASSTC, is a program of the Barnstable County Department of Health and Environment, and is underneath the wastewater division in that particular department. Of course, we are all a part of the wonderful Barnstable County. I hope everybody knows a little bit about Barnstable County and the programs that we have there. I'm going to just give you an overview of some of the programs that our department does, but certainly check out capecod.gov to find out what the rest of the county does, because there are some pretty fantastic services that the county does for everyone that you might not even know about. So, of course, there is Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Technology Center. We are on sunny Joint Base Cape Cod, where we put advanced septic system technologies to the test to make sure that they work like they're supposed to work, to find the best technologies, and to do research and development work into a whole slew of different topics related to wastewater and the things that are in wastewater, things like nitrogen and phosphorus and contaminants of emerging concern. We run an IA tracking database. So out in the Cape Cod area, there's something like 4,000 systems installed of various types of on-site technology. We provide a service to the towns to help them keep track of those systems to make sure that they're functional. We have, as an extension of that program, a new program coming to Barnstable County, which is the Responsible Management Entity Program, which Alexi runs for us. This short version of the RME is that it is a sewer utility for on-site septic systems technologies in those areas where towns might choose to use on-site technologies. We are looking to create something that would essentially create the equivalent of a sewer utility for those systems. So there's a lot of work going on with that particular program. We have the Aqua Fund, which is our low-interest loan program for folks to use to replace their septic system. That could be replacing it with another standard septic system or an advanced technology, or even a sewer connection in those areas where sewers are being used. So be sure to check that out, and we're happy to answer questions about that particular program as well. We have a laboratory at the county, which does a whole lot of water quality monitoring. We do a lot with post landfill closure monitoring. So most of our landfills were closed something like 20, 25 years ago. They were all capped off.
You mean that
So
waste doesn't just go away?
it doesn't just
Oh
go
my
away.
gosh.
No, it's got to stay somewhere. So I don't know. I think we have a picture of it, of our staff out in the field, doing the landfill monitoring. I think you just passed it there.
Oh, there we
That
go.
one there.
There we go.
So that's Lynn Mulkeen. She's out in the field, checking out our landfills to make sure that they're not leaching terrible stuff into our groundwater and our drinking water. So clearly a very important program that most people don't really know about. And then our beach sampling program. So Barnstable County hires what we call the beach sampling crew. And they go out and do samples. They take samples at, I think it's something like 350 different beaches on Cape Cod.
wow.
Every week they do that. Which
Is that even through the winter?
No, that's just a summer program. So it's Memorial Day to Labor Day that they do that. And then, so when your beach is closed because of the bacteria, I mean, I think a lot of people have probably seen those signs at some point. That's our program that's doing the monitoring. You're probably wicked disappointed that you're not going to be able to go to the beach that you wanted to that day. But it does serve a purpose because we're making sure people aren't getting sick from things like fecal coliform.
Yeah, you don't want to
coli.
swim with high counts of bacteria in the water.
Yeah, we're looking for fecal bacteria, basically. So making sure people aren't swimming in that stuff is really important. So, Barnstable County has a whole other host of projects and programs. This is just sort of a small sampling of the water and wastewater services that we do. We're always looking to expand those services and figure out new ways to help the citizens of Cape Cod to the maximum extent that we can. So if anybody has any questions about that, I'm sure we can take them when we get to that point in the show.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. So we have a 9-person team here at MASSTC, and you can see all of our images here. Some of us who are not on site today are also participating in Potty Talk virtually, like all of you. So you'll be able to ask them questions as well. I also wanted to give a shout out to some of our partners. We have a lot of amazing partners that make a lot of our research possible. And so we work with partners at the federal level, at the state level. We work with regional groups. We work with academia, nonprofits like the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition and the Nature Conservancy. And that's really just a sampling. We work with probably over 30 or 40 stakeholders relatively regularly.
A lot of organizations really interested in wastewater.
Yeah, and we also work with local groups too. So they're not all necessarily like government entities. Like we work with local pond groups, for example. So we really work with a broad array of stakeholders. All right. So I think
Before we get into that, Alexi, I did want to say one thing. One thing that we did kind of forget to mention, the start of MASSTC. There's a little bit of history. I think it might be good just to really briefly go into, since we're kind of given a bit of a background here. And everyone might have mentioned, or not mentioned, everyone might have realized that there was one important person missing from the staff picture. And everybody probably knows George Hoyfelder, either personally or by reputation. And he's got his own slide here with some information just about how the test center got started. Brian knows this history much better than I do. I just didn't want to skip past the intro about the founding.
Yeah, I mean, it was started in the early 90s. George and this gentleman named Joe Costa from the Buzzards Bay Project hatched this idea. They like to joke that it's the plan for the test center is somewhere on the bottom of the New Bedford landfill right now. And I would attest that it probably is. But they were looking at the sort of, they were intuiting the future of on-site wastewater treatment and starting to see new technologies coming onto the scene. And there were a lot of claims being made about those technologies, about how well they performed, and there were technology vendors selling their products like it was the best thing since sliced bread, and it worked fantastic all the time. So they came up with this project to say, well, let's test those technologies. Let's see how they actually do in a controlled environment. So the test center was born, and it was opened in about 1999 or so. So we are here on Joint Base Cape Cod at the site of the old wastewater treatment plant. Actually, I think we're the parking lot technically where we are. And we harvest our wastewater from the Coast Guard housing that's on the base, as well as the county jail. Bring it into the facility, do all the testing with it, send it back to them, and give the clients the results. But the mission of the test center, first and foremost, was to verify technologies. And then over time, it's changed to be more toward research and development types of work. And, we still do the technology verification piece of things. But, we're also interested in trying to identify those silver bullet technologies that we're going to need to address our wastewater issues.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Speaking of wastewater, if you are not a wastewater nerd like us, and chances are you might not be, you probably haven't spent much time thinking about what even is wastewater, what qualifies as wastewater, and this is a really good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Wastewater pretty much is any of the water that is coming from your faucets, from your toilet, all of your household water. And where does it go? It goes to either centralized treatment like sewers or wastewater treatment plants, or decentralized treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into some of the details on that, I think, in a minute. But I think so in Cape Cod, 85% of homes are reliant on decentralized wastewater treatment. That's
Mm-hmm.
correct.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's something like 25% nationwide. So 1 in 4
Mm-hmm.
people in the United States relies on an on-site wastewater treatment
Mm-hmm.
system.
Huh.
It's really high throughout New England, but
Mm-hmm.
especially like you said, here in Barnstable County it's really high.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's worth, noting that some of that area can be sewered, but some of it might never be able to be sewered.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of areas where the houses are just too far apart and it would cost a fortune.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of the expense in a sewering project is the pipe that runs down the street, because there's excavation, there's a lot of permitting, there's a lot of disruption to people's daily lives that goes with that. So a lot of the cost of these projects that we're seeing on Cape Cod is associated with the cost of expanding that collection system. So that's one of the, I guess, one of the weaker points of the centralized model for our region in particular is because there are denser parts of Cape Cod. Clearly, our downtowns, Falmouth, Hyannis, a lot of big chunks of Barnstable and, Dennis and Yarmouth. But there are a lot of areas that are still very, rural in nature. Brewster, Orleans, Chatham, Wellfleet, Truro, yeah. Mashpee certainly has, so there are big swaths of Cape Cod where, sewering is going to be an expensive option for us to try to deploy. So, some of the other options out there we present decentralized as an option because, putting that expensive pipe in the ground. So I got off on a little bit of a tangent there, but you give me that little in to talk about the difference between the two, and I have to take it.
So if you're in a city like New York or Boston, you flush the toilet, you turn on the tap, all of that water pretty much goes into the pipes, and then it goes to a centralized place where it is treated and then released. Whereas with decentralized, it's really going into a unit in your backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what it comes down to. And so on Cape Cod, most properties are reliant on decentralized treatment. This includes cesspools. Cesspools are kind of an archaic wastewater technology that has been around for actually well over 1,000 years. There are also septic systems. And if you're from Massachusetts, you probably hear the term Title V thrown around. This is a term that's used to describe just a traditional septic system, which we'll break down in a minute. And then roughly 4,000 homeowners on Cape Cod have innovative and alternative septic systems. And that's something that I think we'll talk about too. I don't know, Sarah, do you want to break down how a septic tank works?
Sure, yeah. So going back to the graphic here, we just have just a conventional, what as Alexi would say here in Massachusetts, we call a Title V septic system. So all the water from your house, laundry water, sink water, toilet water, all goes into a septic tank. The septic tank is where you want to hold that water for at least a few days so that the solids can float up or down and you have some clarified water in the middle. And that clarified water goes out to the drain field. And then it percolates through the soil and then it is recharged to the groundwater. These conventional systems like we have here are really good at taking care of pathogens, so viruses and bacteria. Cesspools that Alexi was mentioning earlier, not so much. With cesspools, we do worry about high counts of bacteria coming from those. And again, not to get too far ahead here, but while these systems, these Title V systems do a good job protecting human health from a pathogen standpoint, viruses and bacteria, doesn't really do much of anything for phosphorus and nitrogen, which I think we all know has become a big problem here and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what an IA septic system first is before we talk a little bit about some of the environmental impacts of our waste?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we usually think about nitrogen reducing IA septic systems. There's actually a lot of different types of innovative and alternative septic systems. There's, types that are specifically made to reduce the amount of carbon. That's, if you've got a restaurant or something like that. There's some that are specifically made to reduce pathogens even further. But really what we think about most in our world in Barnstable County here is the nitrogen removing IA septic system. So usually when we say advanced or innovative, we're talking about those ones that are specifically made to remove nitrogen. We're also starting to think a lot more about phosphorus. So when we say IAs, we're starting to think, I guess, nitrogen and phosphorus. But we're really going to hone in, I think, today and for the foreseeable future, especially with the RME, at nitrogen reducing technologies. So we can see the difference here is really a additional unit in that septic system. So you have the traditional system that's got just the septic tank leading to the leach field. And then the IA system, again, they can be all sorts of different designs, but the difference is they've got something else additionally in the design to remove nitrogen. So in this example, we have a denitrification unit between the septic tank and leach field.
So why do we care about nitrogen? Like, what is the big deal about nitrogen on Cape Cod?
Ooh, the big scary.
Dum dum.
Dum, dum, dum. So we come to the point.
Right. So, yeah. Why don't we want nitrogen coming out from our wastewater into the surrounding environment? We all know, as I think Brian already hinted at this, the pond closures. That's how the pond and the estuary closures is where it really comes into our daily life. There's other things like, if you're selling a property, you need to make sure that the groundwater doesn't have high levels of nitrate. But really, we're thinking about, again, water closures, recreation, shell fishing.
Mm-hmm. And for a region like Cape Cod, those are just all too important. We have an entirely tourist-driven economy here. We don't have big agriculture. We don't have big industry. Everything relies on having people come here and enjoy themselves during the summer. And clearly, if we lose that water resource, if they don't want to come because it's too icky, we quickly lose the revenue associated with that. And then the rest of it, what do we need the commercial center of Hyannis for if nobody's here to use it?
Right.
So it is very important for us to protect these water resources because they are the core of our economy. So there is no, in my mind, there's no decision to be made. It needs to, move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Alexi's actual question was sort of like, how does it happen? Am I remembering right? Yeah. So we already talked a little bit about water moving from the septic system into the groundwater and the surrounding environment. We have it can happen in a traditional system, like the bottom picture there. Again, that water that's going from the leach field to the groundwater is probably pretty clean of viruses and bacteria, but it's probably really concentrated with nitrogen and phosphorus. And if it's a cesspool or a straight pipe, that's going to be even worse. It's going to have even less treatment. So that's all being loaded to our environment, which causes eutrophication. Eutrophication is just a big word for too much nutrients. And the reason that we don't want too much nutrients is like too much of a good thing. The fish and the organisms that are there will, if there's an algal bloom because of too much nutrients, so the algae are in there waiting for nitrogen, and once they get that nitrogen or the phosphorus, then they start growing like gangbusters. And then when they die and they decompose, decomposition takes oxygen. So the microorganisms that are eating up that dead algae are driving down the oxygen level. And this fish will either die like they did in Greenwich Bay in 2003, or they'll swim away. But there's lots of organisms that can't swim away from a low oxygen environment, even if it's like kind of a small area. So that's why you don't want too much nutrient. It's basically it'll cause an algal bloom, and that causes low DO, and it's really bad ecologically.
And it clouds out the sunlight, so then there's no more plant life, right?
Right.
And then you see the resulting collapse of all of these aquatic ecosystems that we all depend on.
Yeah.
And then there are the human health concerns too, right?
Right, right. In particular with the freshwater bodies, we talk about these things called HABs, or harmful algal blooms. And the basic concept there is that, like a nitrogen impacted embayment, with the ponds, when they get too much phosphorus, you get the algae blooms, but they're freshwater algae blooms. And some of those particular algae can produce toxins that they release as part of their life cycle. There's not a lot understood about how that life cycle and toxin sort of interaction works. There's still a lot of active research on that. But those toxins can be toxic to human beings or our pets. And there have been unfortunate stories of dogs who have ingested too much water that's been contaminated with these toxins, and unfortunately they've died. So, for the most part, I think, you and I and us adults who have larger body mass, there's less concern as far as potentially dying from a harmful algal bloom, but they could make us sick. And certainly our children, we need to worry about because they're smaller, and, those things can impact their bodies more significantly.
Yeah, and we are a bit past the point of using most of our well water in Cape Cod. But if we were still on lots of well water, we would want to think about nitrates in our well water, because there's plenty of research that says drinking high levels of nitrate on a long-term basis will maybe give you cancer. It's definitely not good for, as Brian was saying, small children. So that, again, not something we have to worry as much around here because we don't have that many people on well, but that's a big problem in Rhode Island.
Awesome. And so we talked a little bit about innovative alternative septic systems before, but before we kind of go back into that, we've talked about this problem that we're facing here, and this is going to be $1 billion problem, no matter how you address it. It's an expensive problem. It affects, as Brian was mentioning, the economy. It affects our recreation, our way of life, our property values. It really affects everything on Cape Cod and in New England, and also in areas beyond Cape Cod that struggle with the same problem. Nutrient loading is a global problem. And there are many things that we can do to address it. Someone had reached out when registering for Potty Talk and had asked about the Cape Cod Commission Technologies Matrix. This is a really incredible resource that people can use to kind of learn about all of the different ways that we can reduce or remove or remediate nitrogen and nutrients in our environment. And basically what it is this is a tool. You can't see it on our screen, but on the actual website, which is linked below, you can look at individual solutions, you can look at site-based solutions, and you can look at kind of wider solutions that can be applied to address nutrient loading and help us avoid a lot of these environmental and health impacts that we've talked about. So just to talk about it a little bit, there is reduction at the source. And so that's where innovative alternative septic comes in. That's where eco-sanitation comes in, which I don't think we've touched on yet, but
And sewering. Yep.
and sewering. So like that's really kind of turning off the tap at its source, like removing the nitrogen before it enters our environment and becomes a problem. Then we have remediation. So what can we use to pull nitrogen and other nutrients out of the environment once it's already gotten out there? And then there's restoration.
Right. Right.
And am I guessing that you are listing those in order of basically ease of implementation?
Yes.
It seems like it would be easiest to control it at the source. Once it gets out in the environment, it gets really tricky.
And something that's important to note too is that like each of these cost, like they all cost a different amount. They might not all be appropriate for a certain site, right? So site-specific considerations are important. Also, the feasibility of some of these is important. Whether there's political support to use some of these different technologies is important. We can't just think about like remediating nitrogen from a purely economic or technological standpoint. Like there are social considerations and political considerations too, and all of that really determines where and why and whether certain technologies are used to remediate nitrogen in different areas.
Right.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. We think so much about wastewater, but I mean, here too, but especially in other parts of the country, nitrogen and other, pollutants are from stormwater. They're from cranberry bogs, right? They're agriculture, right? Yeah. So we get really, zeroed in on wastewater, and I think it sometimes is a low hanging fruit. But we've got to think about the full picture.
Right. And it's important always, I think, to remember that all of the technologies that are listed in this matrix, they complement one another. I think it's very critical for the towns to not get too focused on one particular methodology or another. It's really about, looking at, what do you have and what are the tools you can use to fix the problem? What's in your toolbox? I mean, you don't use a hammer to put in a screw, you use a screwdriver, right? So using the right tool for the job, I think, is a really critical piece of all of this. And, there's been a lot of really exciting developments in the world of on-site wastewater treatment technology that, I think have helped to make that more of a viable option. Historically, on-site systems maybe haven't been the best option because they didn't work as well as a sewer, let's say. But as we develop new technologies, it's important that we're looking at those and perhaps considering changing our plans slightly so that we can, lower the cost and still end up with a good result at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And another thing to point out too is that these can be applied to have an impact on different timescales too. So some of these have more of an immediate impact than others.
Absolutely.
So we had mentioned eco-sanitation a little while ago, and I don't think we've really dove into specifics on that. So I don't know if either of you want to tackle.
Well, let's talk about eco-sanitation, but let's take a 2-minute break or so and let people, if you want to grab a quick refreshment or go to the bathroom, and we'll come back.
Yeah, just a few minutes. That sounds great.
Awesome.
All right. Welcome back to Potty Talk. For those who may have joined a little bit late, I'm Brian Baumgartel, Director of the Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Test Center. With me today
is Alexi Redmond. I am the Responsible Management Entity Coordinator. I coordinate a utility for on-site septic systems.
And I'm Sarah Wigginton. I'm the microbiologist at MASSTC.
Great. I think we were going to pick up and talk a little bit about eco-sanitation next, right?
Yes. So there are a few of you on the call right now, and there were a few who asked really good questions when signing up about eco-sanitation. And we have an eco-sanitation expert. He's not here with us right now. He's
on the call.
He's on the call. Yeah. Brian Horsley is on the call. But the concept of eco-sanitation is really about capturing the nutrients from our wastewater and reusing it and applying it for agricultural purposes. And this is really revolutionary in the sense that right now, our traditional wastewater models, whether you're using a centralized or decentralized system, really release these nutrients into the ocean, into our streams and rivers. And these are really important nutrients, right? Like nitrogen and phosphorus are both used
It's
a lot.
really expensive to make phosphorus.
Yeah, they're used a lot in
Not make,
agriculture.
mine is what I mean, but you know what I mean. Capture.
And people artificially make nitrogen too, and use that in agriculture. And we import a lot of these nutrients from other countries too. And so if you think about it, the idea of flushing all of these really great nutrients down the toilet and getting rid of them doesn't really make sense.
Now, it's not just getting rid of the nutrients, it's the making wastewater out of clean water when we don't actually have to excrete our waste into water. I was just at the Cape Cod Canal cleanup this weekend and talking to some people, and that never ceases to amaze me how you just say that. Like, it doesn't make sense that we use the bathroom into clean water. And people are always like, that doesn't make sense. Like, they obviously haven't thought of it, but it's like so logical that as soon as you say it, they're like, oh yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of people across the world, and even frankly in the United States of America, who don't have access to clean drinking water. I mean, Flint, Michigan comes to mind immediately, but unfortunately there are a lot of people out there who they don't have access at all. I remember a story that I heard about as part of this group that I was involved with called Dig Deep. And they part of that group was the representative from the Navajo Nation, and they talked about how they have to drive 200 miles, and they're doing an 8-hour round trip to get drinking water, which is a crazy concept. So why do we waste it the way that we do? I mean, flush toilets are fantastic. I won't say that they're not fantastic because it's like a really good solution, and it is widely regarded in public health as being like one of the biggest solutions, one of the biggest inventions for public health that humankind has ever come up with. Because if you look back through history, having poor sanitation killed many, 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 many people. You look at the cholera epidemics and those things. So, it's interesting how things have changed over time, and what we've grown comfortable with.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the different types of eco-sanitation technologies that are out there?
Yeah, sure. Again, Brian Horsley would probably be able to give us the full breakdown of all the different types. But there's composting toilets, which can look all different ways. So you've got a privy, what you might use at a campsite. I think that's probably technically a composting toilet. But there's also composting toilets that you can put in your house, and they look really nice. They just look like normal toilets. They don't smell bad. I actually hear that they smell nice and like piney and fresh.
I can confirm that they do. I have used a couple, and they're they're pretty
exactly
nice.
They're nice. Yeah.
Right.
And then there's also urine diverting toilets, like the the center picture in the graphic here. You can see the urine is collected in the front and the feces would go in the back. Just takes a little bit more user concentration, I guess. But it is a great way of keeping the urine out of the water, which, as Alexi was saying, cuts out a lot of all the waste that we would need to recapture the phosphorus and nitrogen from the urine.
And at this point, it's really important to point out that it's really our urine that is very rich in nitrogen, and so it's urine that is really like part of the problem.
Yeah.
The pee problem.
The pee problem.
Pee problem. Yeah, it is the primary source.
There's also incinerating toilets, foam toilets. I'm probably forgetting a couple of major types, but those are the ones that immediately come to my mind.
Yeah. So lots of alternative toilets and technologies and ways of, not putting the stuff in the water in the first place. And, we put it in the water and then we try to take it back out of the water.
And we move it with water in it. So it's really heavy and takes a lot of greenhouse gases to move.
Yeah, we never think about the energy intensity of our wastewater, our wastewater treatment.
Well, our wastewater treatment. So I read a statistic once that it's something like 2.5% to 3% of global energy production ends up being used in blowing air into wastewater to take the nitrogen from our wastewater and put it back into the atmosphere. And then we spend something like another 2 to 3% via the Haber-Bosch process, which is what creates nitrogen fertilizer, chemical nitrogen fertilizer, to take it back out of the air and then dump it on our fields. Then we eat it, and then we put it back in our water, and then we try to get rid of it. So it's like this crazy cycle that we found ourselves in. And if we have options like urine diversion, where we can actually separate that out and utilize it as a resource, which it is, I don't see how you lose with that scenario. I mean, there obviously, some social acceptance hurdles and those kinds of things, public health concerns. I mean, sanitarians and those who work in the public health industry would say, why would you not want to use a flush toilet? Why wouldn't you just use that if they're so great? So there's a ways to go with it, but it's important for us to keep pushing forward and try to make some headway on it.
And it's also, I mean, maybe it's more of a novel concept for us here in the U.S., but eco-sanitation has been pursued in Europe for decades. And a lot of the original research on it and a lot of the original pilots have come out of different European countries. And they're much more, they use this much more widely. I also know that I think in some state or national parks in the U.S., you may have used some kind of eco-sanitation technology, probably a composting toilet. And so even though this is not something that is currently widely pursued here, there is interest, there is a lot more research coming, and it is definitely more widely pursued in other countries.
Yeah, we just got to get over the adoption thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is something that, as the test center, we're actively pursuing and trying to help figure out how to make that, how to make it work beyond, just separating it out and those types of things. What do we do with those materials? Where do they go ultimately? Because it's clearly we could separate out the urine, and you could utilize it in your own property as a fertilizer, but that sort of defeats the purpose because we have a nitrogen problem. We're trying to keep it out of the watershed. So, how do you make sure that some of that, at least a good sized chunk of that material, gets removed from a property where it's being collected and brought to hopefully some sort of a agricultural facility where it can be used, like they do in Vermont. It's the Rich Earth Institute up there. Yeah.
And I think a lot of what we are doing, we're getting ideas from them. I know Brian Horsley, who we've already said a couple of times is on this call, has reached out to them and worked with them, and they're really, I think, the leaders in this region on eco-sanitation.
Yeah, they have some really novel concepts, and it's figuring out how to manage it is one of the key aspects, and can help to overcome the regulatory hurdles that we inevitably face when trying to switch from flush toilets to something else.
So we've talked about eco-sanitation. We've talked about IA systems. These are considered kind of alternative nitrogen reducing technologies. But how well do these work? This is a question that we hear a lot from homeowners and the general public. So I don't know if one of you want to talk a little bit more about how well do these systems work?
So there was some research that the test center was involved with in the town of Falmouth that tried to provide some incentives for people to install some of these alternative toilet technologies, so that we could get a sense of how well they actually performed. There's unfortunately with that particular project, even despite a pretty decent size stipend that was provided, I think it was something up to $10,000 or something like that. Not a lot of people took Falmouth up on the offer. So we only got sort of a small cross section of different technologies and options. And, in science, we like to make sure we have enough replicates of things, and we duplicate enough so that we can work out the effects and biases and those things that might come up in these experiments. But the technologies themselves, they seem to work, not universally as well as the different ones. Though if you think about it in concept, particularly with urine diversion, I mean, if most of our phosphorus is in urine and you completely remove the urine, if you're capturing it all, you're removing a major source of the phosphorus.
A huge percentage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And nitrogen.
And the nitrogen as well. Yeah. I mean, we can still see a lot of nitrogen in gray water. There's less phosphorus in gray water, in particular since phosphates were removed from soaps. That made a big difference. So if we could figure out, and particularly around our ponds, if we could separate out the urine and keep it from getting into the ponds, we could prevent lots of the phosphorus from getting into the ponds.
Yeah, and another study that was done at the University of Rhode Island in my time there when I was working in a lab that was working on these IA septic systems, they looked at 3 different technologies, and the I think what they mostly found was that, all of the technologies are capable of meeting the regulations that they're approved under. It's a matter of mostly operation and maintenance and proper monitoring. If they're monitored properly and we can make the adjustments we need to make, almost every technology can work. I'm not saying it can work in every single home, because that's another hurdle we come up against a lot with septic system research, is that the activity within a single home does make a lot of difference with how the system operates. But again, that's what the URI group found, was that a closer eye on the systems improves the performance kind of regardless of technology.
And so some of these technologies have been around since the like late 90s and early 2000s. And a lot of these are kind of commercially available on the market. You don't need a special permit to put any of these in. In Massachusetts, these IA septic systems, at least those that are designated to remove nitrogen, are required to get down to 19 milligrams per liter of nitrogen effluent. I know that doesn't really mean much to folks who are not really working in this industry, but the state assumes that a regular septic system that is not designed to remove nitrogen releases 26 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. So it's about a 33% reduction. We have research that suggests that regular conventional septic systems actually release more nitrogen. But regardless, this kind of first generation of IA systems has been around for 20, almost 30 years.
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah, and every year we're seeing new technologies that can remove more and more nitrogen. And so some of these that we're seeing now on small scale, so they're being piloted, they're not generally available. Some of these can remove up to like 80, 90%.
I mean, some of them, it's like, the newest ones are approved for 10 milligrams per liter in their effluent, as opposed to, like you were saying, 19. And, the numbers we're seeing are much smaller than that, up to 95% removal sometimes.
Yeah, which puts them in the realm of what treatment plants can do. Treatment plants are, usually you're looking for certainly below 10, and for Cape Cod, like 3 to 5 milligrams per liter, which represents a significant reduction. But those are the kinds of things that we need to look for when we're talking about nitrogen-reducing technologies, is finding those best technologies.
And the reason that makes a difference, putting in systems that remove have 10 milligrams in their effluent of nitrogen as opposed to 20, it's because when we start thinking about deploying these at scale, thousands and thousands of systems, that difference makes a big difference for if towns are going to meet their nitrogen removal limits or not. So it's important to know which technologies remove the most nitrogen.
And under what conditions
Exactly.
they work best.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's not one size fits all, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So first of all, I wanted to encourage everyone to keep writing your questions and comments in the chat. We have some questions that you sent into us ahead of time that we'll get into in a moment. But again, this is really for you. So we're here to answer any of your wastewater questions. Before we wrap it up, we just kind of wanted to touch on a couple things. What can you do right now to help address our nitrogen problem? And the first is really to talk to your network. So talk to your families, your friends about this nitrogen problem and why it matters and why you care, and maybe about how you've been personally affected. The next would be to participate in your local government. This doesn't just apply to wastewater, but when it comes to wastewater on Cape Cod, at least, a lot of the towns are making these important decisions. So go to the town meetings, read up on these things, and
run for open board seats.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of board seats, particularly boards of health, are by appointment. Go to your town website, look it up. I guarantee you will find vacancies on some board that has to do with water. Particularly boards of health are always looking for membership. So, it's a way that you can volunteer some of your time to participate in your community in a very active way, very unique way of doing it. I advocate for it. I was chair of the Mashpee Board of Health for 5 or 6 years. I only recently stepped down from that position because I have small kids, and I wanted to do Cub Scouts with my son. And I talk about wastewater all day, and going to Board of Health to talk about wastewater was not so appealing at some point. But yes, participate as much as you can, and that goes beyond just going to town meeting and voting. Take an active role.
Yeah, and another important thing that you can do is also to be septic smart. So chances are, if you're on this call, and you're not living in a very densely populated area on Cape Cod, you have a septic system or even a cesspool. And so in that case, don't flush things that are not supposed to go down the toilet.
What's
Some
supposed to go down the toilet, Alexi?
toilet paper, your waste, no masks, no
Yep.
wipes.
No wipes.
wipes.
Even if they say flushable, there is no such thing as a flushable wipe.
Right.
Yep.
I think
we talk about the 4 Ps.
The 4 Ps.
The
That's
4
what we say.
Ps. P. I'll just say them.
Yep.
P. Poop, toilet paper, and puke.
Yep. Yep. The 4 Ps.
It's glamorous.
We bring the glamour.
No, but seriously, take care of your septic systems. I mean, it protects your own investment, and it's going to make sure that your septic system works.
I was also going to say limit the amount of food scraps, and don't ever get a garbage grinder if you're on septic. That's one of the easiest. Yeah, that's one of the easiest things you can do to extend the life of your leach field, which is usually the most expensive thing to replace.
Yep.
So you're reducing the amount of carbon that's going in if you can reduce the amount of food that goes into your sink.
Yeah, they have some pretty cheap. So there are little strainers, the fine mesh strainers that you can get. They're $2-3. They make nice little scrapers that you can get. I think Bed Bath & Beyond sells them. They're like 99 cents.
Bed Bath & Beyond is gone, Brian.
Yeah.
It's gone.
They're done.
Oh no. Well, go to Amazon then.
The Amazon,
Go to
exactly.
Amazon, order them online. They're just 99 cents, little pieces of plastic. We should use less plastic, but in this case, let's make an exception.
Yeah. Use that same piece of plastic for like 10 years to scrape your grease into your trash can.
Scrape your grease, scrape the food scraps. Even better, compost that material rather than just putting it in the trash, and reduce another waste stream in the process.
The worst place it can go is the water, then trash cans next best, and then gold standards composting.
And EPA has a whole initiative based around Septic Smart. I actually think they have a Septic Smart Week sometime in the fall. So if you want to learn more about how you can kind of protect your septic system and make sure that it's functioning well, you can go to the EPA website and just look up Septic Smart, and they'll have a whole list of things that you can do to make sure you're right on track. Another important thing that you can do is bring friends to Potty Talk. So this is really meant to be kind of more of an introductory episode for folks. We will be diving deeper into specific wastewater topics, no pun intended.
Yeah.
So we'll definitely have one that is strictly focused on eco-sanitation, but we could have Potty Talks on really any topics that you are all interested in. So please feel free to bring a friend and spread the word. And then another thing that you can do is also bring folks to tour MASSTC. We they're free. They're tour. You can come into our site, learn about some of the different technologies that we have here, and then we're also happy to come to you. So maybe you are on a board of health, or maybe you're a teacher and you want to reach your students and talk to them about wastewater. We're happy to pretty much come in at any time. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Absolutely.
And so before we get into the question and answer, I know that environmental problems can be really overwhelming. Like it's not always kind of the brightest field. There's a lot of doom and gloom, especially when we think about things like climate change. But and yes, like the picture for Cape Cod sometimes can look bleak unless we act. But we can fix this crisis. It's going to take a lot of collective action. We're going to have to try some new and different technologies and be really intentional about where these technologies applied. But the good news is that the technology exists. So if you recall that Cape Cod Technologies Matrix that we had up, 20-30 minutes ago, I think there are roughly like almost 100 technologies in the matrix altogether, correct?
When you put it all together, it's really huge. If you go to the online version of it where you can click on it, it's a little bit overwhelming for sure.
Overwhelming in such a good way, though.
Yeah.
Overwhelming hope.
It's a very big toolbox, to extend that analogy. A lot of different screwdrivers, a lot of different hammers in there, a few different types of pliers involved.
But we do know that we can't afford to keep kicking the can.
Mhm.
Like we can't. Like it comes down to, it literally comes down to our livelihoods here on the Cape, but also in other areas. And we're kind of at a critical point now where regulations are potentially starting to change, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the Q&A. But there will be more financing for some of these alternative technologies like IA systems, hopefully like eco-sanitation that develop over time. And we are starting to see kind of new financing mechanisms. But it's also important to remember that there are hundreds of really brilliant and passionate people in our state working specifically on the nitrogen problem in Cape Cod, but also like hundreds of thousands of people working in the environmental field and in other related fields addressing environmental problems across the US. And so if you ever get sucked into that kind of doom and gloom mentality, fear not. Like there are a lot of people working really hard behind the scenes to address this.
Never underestimate the power of a small group of passionate people to make very big change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think with that, we have a slide up on your screen right now. I don't think you're able to click it, but we will send that to you in the chat momentarily. These are just some other resources that you can go to learn a little bit more about wastewater topics in general, about traditional septic systems, about alternative septic systems, and some of the work being done in our region. And there are many other sites out there. These are just kind of a few to kind of get you started. And I think now's probably a good time to get into some of the questions that folks had sent us.
Yeah, maybe we just take a short break again here at this point,
Okay.
and then we'll come back and we'll get into questions.
Couple of minutes and then, that sounds good.
Sounds good. All right, and we're back.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Just looping us back to a logistical point about the Q&A before we dive in. You can ask a question one of two ways. We've already had some people put it in the chat. That's fine. If you don't want to type, if you'd rather ask your question verbally, hit the raise hand button and we will unmute you when it's your turn to ask a question. So if you'd rather do it verbally, go ahead and hit that raise hand question or button.
So one of the first questions that we are going to tackle is, can the Cape Cod Fund, so can Aqua Fund, be used to fund the purchase and installation of a urine diversion toilet like the Wastman, I might be pronouncing that wrong, EcoFlush, or the Cinderella Comfort incinerating toilet?
So the answer is yes. The shortest answer to that question. The Aquafund program can cover really any of these types of projects, and thankfully there was some recent legislation that allowed us to offer the loan program out to those who are doing things voluntarily. So if you're upgrading voluntarily to one of these advanced technologies, this program can help you fund those projects. It's worth noting, though, that until your municipality or town requires you to do something like that. So if the town says, okay, you need to use composting toilets because we're going to use composting toilets in this area, at least at the present time, you wouldn't be able to get the 0% interest rates that we offer through that program, but you could get a 4% interest rate in those situations. And frankly, looking at interest rates right now, I think that's a pretty good deal, even at 4%.
Yeah. Awesome. So thanks so much for the question. Our next question is, can you define gray water? And then can you also elaborate on how food scraps, et cetera, affect septic systems?
Yeah, sure. I can take that one. So gray water is, so we've got gray water and black water. Gray water is water that basically hasn't had excrement in it. So like sink water would be gray water. And then laundry water, is that also gray water, or is that technically black water?
No, I think laundry water typically gets classified as gray water along with showers, as long as you're not peeing in the shower. Many people will pee in the shower.
Yeah, so if you have a composting toilet or you put in a urine diverting toilet, that is something to think about, is that you still have water that you make in your house. So you would still have to have like a Title V system for the gray water to go to. But yeah, that's what gray water is just, without excrement in it, basically, or pee. And then the other question about how food scraps can sort of exacerbate the failing of a leach field. So the carbon that is in those food scraps is food for the microorganisms that are out in the leach field. And if they get overwhelmed, then it clogs up the leach field. So if there's more carbon than those little microbes can chew up, then the pores in the media, the sand or the soil gets clogged and the water can't go through anymore. And when you have a leach field that they call it, hydraulically overloaded, it just means it can't accept water anymore. That's when you start to get a backup into your tank and then a backup into your house. And then you call the honey wagon to come pump out your septic tank, and they tell you some bad news that your leach field is clogged. And if you have a garbage grinder, that's going to happen like, I don't know, 15 years sooner than it would have if you don't. So if you can carefully manage those scraps, you can, extend the life of that leach field.
Yeah.
Awesome. So another question that we have is, I work for an IA operator. I was wondering if you had fact materials we could pass along to our customers, especially the homeowners that inherit their IA system. They don't understand how it all works. That is an awesome question. I will tackle that one. So yes, we have 1- and 2-page documents that were specifically written for public audiences and homeowner audiences that really explain at a basic level how these systems work. We are more than happy to send those to you. You actually can access these right now under the Responsible Management Entity tab on our website. But we will also, we can link these in the chat too before this is over, and we can email them to you as well. Another question that we have, the adoption of IAs and eco-sanitation by homeowners will hinge on financial assistance beyond low interest loans. How soon do you see money becoming available to help homeowners pay for these solutions?
Oh, that's a great question. One we're actively working on. I don't know if folks recall or follow the state budget process. Most people probably would, give a bleh to that. But one of the things that Governor Baker did before he left office was to put together a supplemental budget request. And that included a pretty significant amount of money to help Cape Cod with its wastewater problems, something to the tune of $200 million. And that set of funds would have provided our septic loan program with some funds to do loan forgiveness, so we could forgive the principal on some of our loans for folks. And we were pretty excited about that. but unfortunately, it didn't. It ran into some problems due to some state regulations that forced the state to give a lot of our tax money back. We all got those little checks in the mail.
Oh, yeah.
Probably 5-6 months ago. Well, that was this program being dished out
Oh,
to everybody across the state, unfortunately.
Alexi, you're not in Massachusetts, so you didn't get that.
Yeah,
but
you didn't get the sweet Massachusetts check. And unfortunately, well, yeah, I won't even get into the further detail of that. The state did pass a $15 million package that came down to the Cape, and unfortunately, that significantly cut into the possibility of doing that with that program. But we are looking at ways that we can help homeowners to pay for these things beyond just loans, because if you can't afford a loan, that's not very helpful. We can offer 0%. Woohoo, thank you, but I still can't do
It's still expensive.
$200 a month, and especially in a place where the cost of living is very high. I mean, when was the last time you walked out of the grocery store with a bag of groceries that was less than $50?
Right.
So there are families who are already stretching their budgets as far as they can go. So we need to figure out ways that we can really help those people, because they're the ones who are doing they're running our cash registers. They're doing our landscaping. They're doing all these very critical jobs that Cape Cod, it doesn't really work very well without everybody who's here.
And they're taxpayers too.
They're taxpayers too. They should be able to avail themselves of those tax dollars. And we can't just expect that they're going to go live off Cape somewhere. So it's important for us to try to find those resources. To the extent to which we can, we're working toward trying to identify and secure some of that funding. It's not here today. I can't promise that it's going to be here even tomorrow. But we're working on it. And there are some people at the State House who are also working on that particular issue. So,
And right now there's also a tax credit in Massachusetts for homeowners who have to install or make modifications to a septic system. I think that's $6,000 right now. It's a rebate, correct?
It is a rebate. It's a tax rebate. Yeah.
So, which unfortunately doesn't benefit everyone, but there is a proposal right now to increase that to $12,000. So that could potentially be significant.
That would be helpful, but we need the money. We
Right.
need the,
Yes.
we need the money
Absolutely.
down here.
Need it yesterday.
Exactly.
So I just want to move on to make sure that we get everybody's questions. So our next one is a really good one. Is there any update from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection about the promulgated Title V regulations? So just a little bit of background. The Title V regulation is really what regulates the installation and the use of septic systems in the state of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection is responsible for that regulation. And in November, was it November or October? Just recently.
Yeah, well, they released the original regulations back in the spring of last year. It was like May or June of last year. They went around to all the individual towns and asked them, hey, what do you think of this? And then they did a public comment and received, obviously, a lot of very negative comment.
There's an extension to the public comment.
Right, which they closed. I think January 30th is when the last public comment closed.
Yes, and so this proposed change would be to expand the regulation to new natural resource nitrogen sensitive areas. And there's actually a tool that the Mass DEP has where you can actually see what kind of the boundaries of these new potential areas would be. But on Cape Cod, this would affect a significant number of homeowners. And basically, the Massachusetts DEP is saying that towns either have to create a watershed permit and implement a watershed permit over the course of 20 years. And I'll let Brian give kind of more of the details on this. But this essentially allows for an adaptive management approach to managing wastewater in each town, or if a town does not do the watershed permit, which we don't think will be the case, homeowners in these nitrogen sensitive areas would have 5 years to install an innovative and alternative septic system.
And that's not just homeowners doing new construction or the typical things. That's everybody who has a residence in those areas would have to upgrade in 5 years.
Which is most Cape residents.
good, certainly a giant
A very
swath
big
of them.
chunk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
mostly in the south
Yeah.
shore of the Cape, and then on up through, a little bit of the outer Cape as well. But there are other areas that are going to be added to the nitrogen sensitive area lists.
Do you want to talk about a tiny bit about the watershed permit?
Yeah, the watershed permit is a concept that's been around since 2014. It was enabled by the legislature. And back then it was proposed as a way for towns to build efficiency into the means by which they could utilize some of these alternative ways of taking care of wastewater. So in areas where sewer just wasn't going to make a whole lot of sense for them, that they could put together a permit that would say, we're going to use permeable reactive barriers here, and we're going to use IA systems here, and we're going to use, shellfish in this part of the watershed. And it gave a nice mechanism for DEP to make sure that those things were actually happening, and also to provide the means by which the towns would monitor those things. So that was, put forth in 2014, but there was no requirement for towns to do watershed permits at that point. And I think DEP saw that as an opportunity with the watershed permit to say, instead of forcing everyone necessarily to install IA systems within 5 years, let's give the towns the flexibility that they need to and use this watershed permit. The towns themselves, for their part, have pushed back pretty heavily, saying, we've been doing comprehensive wastewater management planning for a long time now. Particularly towns like Chatham has one that's decades ahead of a lot of the other towns in the Cape. They're saying, well, we've been doing this. This is just going to slow us down. We need to keep moving forward. So there's been a lot of dialogue between the towns, town officials, and DEP, and others in the state government to try to come to some sort of an agreement on what's workable. I think we will probably see some form of the regulations that were presented. Again, this is just me purely kind of guessing the best, using the best information that I can at some point within probably the next year or so. But I think there's definitely a willingness on most sides to try to come to some sort of compromise on some of these things, because it is a significant change to the way we're doing business.
And the short answer is that there is no real update yet. As Brian was saying, we don't really know what these regulations are actually going to look like. We do know that DEP is going through every single comment that they received, and they received thousands of public comment. And so it's not entirely surprising that we haven't heard anything. But we may hear something soon.
Yeah, it's a lot of comment for them to go through. I mean, we work with a lot of folks at DEP, and I don't envy them in having to go through some of those comments.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have another question in the chat. Before we get to that question from Jane, we had a homeowner ask us, well, I have a perfectly functioning Title V system. Is it possible in a low invasive and least costly way to upgrade that system? So I'm a homeowner with a functioning Title V. How can I upgrade it?
That's not an easy answer, unfortunately. I think that we get that question, that sort of question a lot. What is the easy fix for me to do something better? Because people want to do better, and unfortunately, there's just not a super straightforward, easy thing that you can just plop in your septic tank or your toilet and it makes it better. At least not that we've found so far. Who knows, that technology could come out tomorrow. But for the most part, if someone says that you can pour something down your drain and it's going to magically fix your septic system, there's probably nothing to that. Probably not.
And we have seen a lot of those products come through here over the years. And we could say fairly universally that they do not work.
Yeah. So, I think that if anyone finds that silver bullet, that would be great. But to actually answer the question, a few things that we, have seen incorporated into designs to make them better. None of them are easy. I'll just go ahead and say that. But some of the older types of IA systems that we were talking about that maybe don't reduce down to the level that we really need them to. If you have one of those older systems and you're like, oh, I really wish it was doing better. Something that, some places have done is install a wood chip box after those systems, and sometimes that really increases the nitrogen removal. But that's if you already have an IA system. Another option, and this would probably be better for somebody who has the Title V and is replacing it with the Title V. You could go with a low distribution soil treatment area. So traditional Title V systems are put in, the septic tank is connected to a leach field that's really low in and deep in the soil, and so it's closer to the groundwater. There's lots of technologies for dispersal of the wastewater from your septic tank that aren't technically nitrogen removing IAs, that you can put them just much higher in the profile of the soil, and that will increase nitrogen removal. It'll increase phosphorus removal. But again, that's not an easy thing that you just do.
Right. It still involves
Right. Yeah. So, the easiest thing you could do is divert your own urine. But then you have to have somewhere to put it.
Another thing that you can do, and so these technologies are still kind of being tested, but some IA systems that we're seeing now can actually be retrofitted to an existing system. So if your tank and your leach field are in excellent condition and are functioning, and depending on the characteristics of your property, you can actually add just like a simple denitrifying component, not a whole system, to retrofit, and that does save you money in the long run. I mean, all of it it's all expensive, right? But you can retrofit a perfectly good system and not have to replace the whole thing if you don't have to.
And I will say, we are looking high and low for the silver bullet, and when we find it, we will let you know.
We will be singing about it from all the mountaintops.
And so someone also asked, are there retrofits for Title V cluster systems? The short answer is no. Cluster systems, there are some cluster IA systems, not many of them on Cape Cod, there's a couple on Cape Cod and Islands.
Yeah, there are cluster systems here and there, and for those who might not know,
what's a cluster system?
A cluster system is just basically it's kind of like between an on-site system that's connected to one house and a little miniature treatment plant. It pipes maybe 4 to 5 houses together, or maybe 10 to 20. Brings it to a central location and treats it there on a small scale. Unfortunately, in our region, unless you're doing new development and you're putting in all the new infrastructure, it's a new subdivision or something like that where you can do all that stuff from the start. You can fairly easily do cluster technologies, and we do see those coming up. But in situations where areas are developed, it's hard to do cluster technologies.
And like a lot of Cape Cod is.
It's fairly well developed at this point. There's not a lot of free and open land. So clusters are tough, and it relies on individual homeowners agreeing to combine their wastewater, combine our, like Captain America, what was it, Captain Planet, with our powers combined.
We can treat our whole neighborhood's wastewater.
So we have another great question in the chat. Can you comment a bit more on how water conservation will help us save both water and energy in whatever wastewater treatment we use, including the town-wide sewer projects?
I mean, I think one of the biggest advantages of decentralized technologies is that they are lower power use basically by default. Even where we're talking about advanced on-site technologies, they typically pound for pound are using less energy to do the same thing, because you're able to utilize more of what nature does for us at a pace that nature likes to do it. One of the things that treatment plants suffer from is we're trying to make bacteria do things that really quickly, and that can get thrown out of balance really quickly. If they get a slug of something coming down the line that disrupts their process, they can swing from being in compliance to out of compliance in a very short period of time. And you're talking about millions of gallons of water flowing through.
Big pipes, big problems.
Big pipes, big problems. So these technologies, in particular in the case of these, the wood chip technologies that we've been taking a deep dive on, use minimal amounts of power. You're typically talking about maybe a small air pump that uses, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, and I don't even want to botch what the numbers are.
I've heard a lot of people say, especially for the lowest use ones, it's like running a light bulb. It's the same amount of power use. I think that they're allowed to still call them passive systems as long as they use one pump or less. So
Right.
one pump is still passive because it's such a small amount of energy.
And some of the wood chip systems, the soil treatment systems that we're looking at, I mean, it's a pump that runs, 4, 5, 6 times a day for a minute or less. So it's really small amounts of power that are utilized because we're using nature to do work for us. And it has the additional advantage that if you reduce your water consumption overall, obviously you're using less power to treat that water, and you're using less upstream power. So if the town needs to produce less water, it costs less energy for them to do so. I mean, thankfully on Cape Cod we have really good groundwater at this point, and for the most part we can pump it and send it out to where we want it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be that way. And if you look in a lot of parts of the country where you just can't do that, or they rely on surface water supplies, like the town of Falmouth relies on surface water supplies, where that has to be treated in some way before it can be sent out. So, conservation of water has kind of a doubling effect. You're doubling on saving it from the source, and you're doubling on saving it in the sink, where you're trying to put it ultimately.
Yeah. We are trying to eliminate wastewater from people's vocabularies. It's all just water because we'll have to clean it up and reuse it. So it's just water.
Right, exactly. If we don't have to treat it so much in the first place. Which was, and I will say here, it was one of the brilliant things about a standard Title V system. I mean, obviously we have problems with them, but for what they do well, they don't really require a lot. I mean, they don't require any power. It's your flush is really what goes into it.
Yeah.
And it does all of that work just sitting there, doing it quietly every single day.
All it needs is gravity.
Yeah.
Move that water along.
So,
and the occasional pumping.
yeah, it's too bad that Title V systems have created this problem because they really are a pretty good solution for just what they do well.
So we are kind of coming up towards the end of this podcast. So if you have any kind of last burning questions, please put them in the chat. We will also put our MASSTC email in there so that you can email us your questions, or if you have ideas for any future podcasts, please let us know. I have a couple more questions that are maybe a little bit more technically focused, that we can maybe address kind of at a basic level now and then do an eco-sanitation webinar at a later date. Somebody asked, are you ready to introduce your early plans for a urine depot?
Well, the short answer is no. But we're working on the back end logistics of that at this point. We're looking at sources of funding, perhaps in the form of grants and those things to pull together the infrastructure so that we can start to, create that service here at the test center. So very early on, not quite ready to introduce it yet, but, we certainly will let everyone know when we are ready to.
We talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
We've got lots of plans.
Exactly.
And we have a lot of partners who are also really interested in this. And so that really helps.
Especially, I just heard, again, I'm giving Brian Horsley another shout out, but something about someone buying urine, right? Somewhere not too far from us, I think somewhere in New England, maybe it was Vermont, that people are starting to buy back the urine. So
it was the Rich Earth Institute has this sort of urine recycling program up there. They have what's called a urine pasteurizer. So they take it and pasteurize it just like you would with milk, and that kills off all the bacteria and viruses.
Alexis seems unsure if it's exactly like milk.
I'm sorry if I just ruined milk for everyone. So it's okay, not like milk, not like yogurt. Anyway, pasteurization is just a process of heating something and under pressure. So they pasteurize urine, and then historically they've been giving it to farmers to put on their fields, and they've just recently started charging for that. And I think they're charging $400 per whatever. I don't know what the unit is.
Wow.
Yeah, so
liquid gold, right?
Liquid gold, exactly.
So we have another question in the chat. My impression is that Brian just said Title V systems have created this problem. Yes. Is there any estimate of how much nitrogen and phosphorus has been put into groundwater or ponds or estuaries specifically from these traditional Title V systems on the Cape and Islands?
That's a great question. And and not an easy
Yeah,
one to
yeah.
answer. I mean, we could talk about, let's just talk about per person first of all, right? So we were doing a little bit of the math before today, and I think we arrived at, the amount of water one person uses. I think we calculated out is something like 10. If you have a small car, you fill the tank up about 10 times. That's about the amount of water a person uses in a year,
Yep.
right?
It's like 145 gallons.
About 145 gallons
Yeah.
of urine not of urine. Sorry, urine,
Yeah.
not wastewater, but strictly urine.
Yeah.
So fill your small car up 10 times.
And that is roughly 9 pounds of nitrogen.
Roughly 9 pounds of
And
nitrogen. Yeah.
So 9 pounds. What weighs 9 pounds?
Oh, like if you bowl,
A newborn baby.
Have a newborn baby. Exactly.
A big one, I guess. That's what you said.
What were some of the others I saw? So,
a jug of milk.
the magic of the internet, you can say, give me things that weigh 9 pounds. And it actually comes up with a list. Yeah, there was a gallon of milk on there.
Xbox, I think, or maybe not Xbox. A PlayStation.
PlayStation was about that weight. So that's the amount of nitrogen.
And then it was a pound of phosphorus, right?
Yes.
Per year. Yeah.
Right. So, a pound. I mean, if you use the little mini weights at the gym, maybe that's like a pound.
But then if you're getting paid how much per pound, it's a lot. I mean,
yeah,
just
exactly.
But when you think about like a person's 9 pound contribution of nitrogen just from their urine, and then you multiply that out across every person on Cape Cod, that's crazy.
Over decades.
Yeah. I can't do the back of the envelope math now, but I think that we did just set up the numbers we would need to do the math in the question the caller answered or asked.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you think about it, we had to put enough nitrogen in our groundwater, which is billions of gallons of groundwater in the Cape Cod aquifer. In order to pick up some sort of a signal of nitrogen in that, the amount of nitrogen that you would have to add to that is really mind-boggling.
Yeah. We're talking huge numbers. Maybe next time we'll try to crunch some of those.
Yeah.
Awesome. So it is 7:00. Thank you so much all for joining us, for sending in your questions. It's really exciting for us to do this for you. And we hope that this was helpful in answering some of your questions. I just added to the chat our email where you can send us, again, any ideas for future podcasts that you have. We will be bringing guests into some of our future podcasts. And we're targeting sometime in June for our next Potty Talk.
Our next one. Yeah, we do it more frequently, but we're only 3 people.
Yeah.
We're busy looking for solutions, so we'll do these as frequently as we can.
Yeah. And for those who might not see the chat, our email is masstc@capecod.gov. So please feel free to reach out to us. And thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a great night.